as was already stated, and I'll state again, Shay-Akil McLean. I'm a PhD candidate in the PEAK program, and this is basically what I did for my dissertation. Du Bois meets Darwin. So one of the things that I find interesting is people are often more likely to know the white guy on the left, but not the black guy on the right. There are about 3 levels of wrong in that problem. But Darwin and Du Bois share a number of different things in common. So one of the things I think that was most important regarding to Du Bois's work is really mainly the social construct of race. The concept of social constructionism is something that his work actually paid very, very close attention to and tried to make sense of. Because ultimately, he was studying the biological definitions of race and presenting a critique of them, a particular critique, a historical critique that showed that there is a materialist explanation for the existence of racial categories, or the idea, concept that there are human races. And it's in collusion directly with white labor and capital. The similarity is in the importance and focus on materialist, historical materialist understandings, most importantly. The essential nature of the Darwinian revolution was the replacement of a metaphysical view of variation among organisms by a materialistic view. So this is one of the things that's also extremely important for us to take into consideration. In a number of different ways, both of them seem to be studying something that has to do with interactions and change over time. And that's another commonality. So with regards to what scientists are doing to try to combat biological race concepts, the critique is in an interesting place. I'll say that. Contemporary arguments are generally structured like this. There's a racist claim, example, Troublesome Inheritance, a book that was published by Nicholas Wade in 2014. Wade argues that there are genetically definable and identifiable groups that can be described as biological races in humans today. The anti-racist counter is a scientific critique that contains 2 pillars of thought. One, the natural sciences pillar, the idea that race is not biological or genetic. Then the social sciences pillar, the idea that race is a social construct. So one of the things that's important to recognize is that no matter what side of the argument somebody is on about whether or not race is biological, for the most part, everybody's agreeing that race is not racism. Basically, that the ideas are completely separate, and not only completely separate definitively, but also in a number of different ways existentially. And I say that in the sense that they understand race as physical differences, humans that are grouped by physical differences who share common physical traits and culture and et cetera, et cetera. That's what they define race as. Racism is just conflict between races. We have a problem with a definition, not to mention the fact that everybody seems to agree the last 500, 600 years didn't happen, which is a whole nother problem. So these are issues because the genetic variation that we have today is a direct product of racism acting through time. We can't deny that. So how do we then go about trying to make sense of this, right? What questions do we ask? Well, ultimately, the unanswered questions left by the critique, the scientific critique of race, are really about kind of like, okay, so what is race then? If it's not biological, it's a social construct. Okay, so what is a social construct? And that's where usually everybody gets lost. So I think the unanswered questions are, if race is socially constructed, Why are we seeing biological differences between races, however defined? And how can the biological effects of racism be studied without racializing biology and genetics? And this is an important question because I really don't know nobody who can do that all like that. I've I've yet to see it in many places, or anywhere, if that's for that matter. So, central components to the anti-racialist critique. They have a general creed and statement that has two components. When they describe human genetic variation, they say race is not biological. They make the statement that there is more genetic variation within groups than among groups. Two, the most genetic diversity is found in populations in Africa. These two statements are generally at the core of every response that you will see geneticists, biologists, anthropologists, or sociologists rebutting biological race concepts with. And the thing is that there's something up with it. They seem like they should go together, but they don't. So let's ask another question. How do population geneticists use race to describe human variation prior to approximately 500 to 600 years ago? They don't use race to understand human genetic variation before that. Population geneticists have their main responsibility and central function regarding the work that they do in their analysis is that they are storytellers. The models that population geneticists use are components to help provide explanations of dynamics through time that can tell us about what happened in the past and why the present is the way that it is. And the thing is that in this image, what you have in this image is a model, the Out of Africa model of what is considered a great diasporic movement of humans across the planet, the globe, over time and space. The important thing about this is that what's being described in this model is that there's an interaction of genetic drift with gene flow. So as people move farther away from each other, and as well as dynamics that are occurring as people interact with one another and meet one another through space and time. And these dynamics, they vary. There's a number of different conditions that can produce the patterns that we see today. And that's something we should be taking into consideration, right? So in referencing that pattern, most genetic variation is due to gene flow and genetic drift. Augustine Fuentes in his critique of Nicholas Wade. Dr. Jennifer Rabb's critique, pretty much the same. Interesting thing is they both referring to isolation by distance, a pattern we geneticists refer to as isolation by distance. Arbitrary clusters of sample populations. But the next highlight, most genetic diversity is found in populations in Africa where our species originated. These are actually contradictory in a really interesting way. So isolation by distance is an equilibrium model. And it describes a process of the interactions between two evolutionary forces, genetic drift and gene flow. That's to some relevant extent, of course, understood as migration. In isolation by distance, the differentiating effects of genetic drift and the homogenizing effects of gene flow, those interactions cancel one another out. So once this model hits equilibrium, the variation does not change. It just, if there's anything that perturbs it away from it, it just bounces it back up to equilibrium. And that's weird because we know we need to know the order and timing of events to understand the magnitudes of their effects on variation. If that's the case, well, how will we know anything if it just keeps going back to equilibrium? We wouldn't. So that's a contradiction to the Out of Africa model, which is basically a statement about events, mass population events, bottlenecks, and founder effects. These aren't, and this is important for us to understand, this is not describing contemporary human genetic variation today. So in understanding isolation by distance, one of the things that I think is useful is to try to think about things through space. Ultimately, we can ask a sense of simple questions. Where do you get your genes? Your parents. Well, in order for that to happen, your parents have to meet physically in space. More specifically, gametes must meet. And in this model, basically, Wright is saying that there is a particular relationship with regards to the position that gametes have relative to one another, the probability of them interacting with one another, and in particular kinds of interactions, of course, because we're thinking about the possibility of the process of procreation. So one of the things that I think is the most interesting thing through about this is this is conceived through a concept of a neighborhood, right? Neighborhood size. So people are interacting with one another through space based on dispersal distances. So the problem is isolation by distance is being referred to as a pattern. It's actually a process, a particular kind of dynamic process that involves evolutionary forces. The equilibrium erases any record of events. So that means this is contradictory in the history that the social scientists and anti-racists are trying to say they are pointing to with social constructionism. We're also being told what race is not. Race is not clinal, race is not typological, race is not cladistic, race, race is not genetic, race is not biological, race is not geographic. Like, yeah, I could go on. We don't know, well, what is race? And we will, so we're also not being told what race is, right? Or what the relationship race has to biological variation, especially genetic. And that goes to the point that we've kind of been using a really, really weird starting point that Dr. Kim Tallbear referred to as biogeographic point of originality. So Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, population geneticist who worked on the Human Genome Project, Diversity Project, he's made a really direct statement when he wrote about what they did with the project, specifically in regards to sampling. Samples from populations of anthropological interest with regards to those that were in place before the Great Diaspora started in the 15th and 16th centuries, when navigation of oceans became possible. These diasporas caused significant population admixture. So there's a problem. Every time that we model contemporary human genetic variation, we place it out of time because we talk about it in reference to what the pattern looked like. We think the pattern looked like approximately 500 to 600 years ago. So we're talking about 500, 600 years ago as now, and just looping it back and forth. It's actually really weird. It's also weird because race didn't exist then. That's something that Du Bois's work shows us. That's important to recognize. So, how do we talk about genetic variation in race today? Well, specifically, we use admixture models, and what you have on the right hand side is an ancestry plot from the sample used in my dissertation for my preliminary results. Is looking at the relationship between percentage of African ancestry and specifically one measure of racial identity, quote unquote, self-identified race or ethnicity from the participants in the study. And we have the sample is 89, the size is 89. So the admixture models are making that temporal mistake. They're distorting time. Human genetic variation is framed in form of, in terms of approximately 500, 600 years ago. But interestingly enough, by doing that, you ignore all the dynamics in between. So the next question is, what are the dynamics that we've been ignoring, and what role do they play with regards to the relationship they have to the structure of human genetic variation? So, once again, going back to that definition of sire, as you saw the race self-identified racial identity that was being measured in that graph, the ancestry plot, is basically like this definition from the American Sociological Association of Race. Race refers to physical differences that groups and cultures consider socially significant, which isn't really all that different from ethnicity, as you can see. And I wonder what their definition of ancestry is, because race is not genealogical ancestry, nor is it genetic ancestry. So that's interesting. And the definition of racism is political, of course, and it has to do with politics and policy. But the interesting thing is it's understood as intergroup relations. That's not how any of this works. The thing that's important about the significant points that Du Bois made with regards to social constructionism is he pointed to particular sets of dynamics and events and like strings of different events in different places that occurred that were relevant and significant in regards to affecting people, tons of people throughout different regions. Every time anything happens to one person, it's not happening to one person. It's involving an interaction. It's more than one person. So it's important to note. And he pointed that dynamic out with regards to recognizing that racialized distinctions are the result of just racism. The only reason why race is required is because of racism. Race is always already an ism. So, in order to figure out what's going on with really what we're seeing with respect to contemporary human genetic variation, we have to go back a few hundred years to see what happened. And that means that we have to explain how racism has affected human populations and led to the current distribution of human genetic variation that we see. So, in my chronological analysis of the what I refer to as the sites of social construction of race, and emphasis on sites as a reference to the work of um, Dr. Oyewumi, who's a sociologist, wrote the book The Invention of Women, regarding the introduction of the category of women into Nigerian society through British colonial rule. And I will get to the point of the timeline. This helps demonstrate what's going on. Let's see where we are. 14th century, great crisis of European feudalism, transoceanic slave trade. We have an estimation approximately around 1451. Could be before that. We don't know. Well, we don't know. No, not exactly. Pope Nathaniel V issued a papal decree to seize, capture, and enslave all enemies of Christ along the west coast of Africa. Then we get into the region that usually the sociologists like to talk about, which is around the 1500s, specifically regards to the encomienda system in Latin America. The 17th century was a very interesting time. Everybody, we know a number of people who love the 1619 number. Um, Party Sequitur Ventrum is a law that was passed in Virginia in 1662, extended the status of freedom or slavery from a mother to a child. Pay close attention to that. 1662. It wasn't until 1669 that there was the first legal use of the term white. So what happened? Oh, well, interesting enough, Party Sequitur Ventrum and then Bacon's Rebellion. So as a consequence, and of course as an attempt to combat and resist any form of worker solidarity, the status of indenture and then the status of chattel began to be, quote unquote, what we know today as racialized. So these events are significant. Going to the 18th century, you see experimentations in racially segregating cities in British India, in Calcutta. Comte de Buffon is introducing race into the study of human variation. And my favorite, the Haitian Revolution between 1791 and 1804. And the interesting thing is, in 1803, There is a letter written by John Sullivan, who was a colonial administrator, that suggests that the British uh, introduced Chinese indentured servants to the island of Trinidad to both suppress rebellion of African slaves and expand capitalist production with a free race who could be kept distinct from the Negroes and used as a racial barrier between the British and the Negroes. Thomas Jefferson, 1820, calling the slave breeding industry an addition to capital. These things are not coincidences. They're related events. Now, mind you, all of that happened, and we see how race is made. And that was before the term gene was ever coined and before the term eugenics was coined. We're dealing with the problem of the racialization of human biology and genetics, not geneticization or biomedical, is the racialization of human biology and genetics. It's the only biology and genetics we've ever known. The only thing we know is racism, unfortunately. Thanks, white people. European colonizers created race to address every capitalist crisis, market disaster, and or form of resistance that they would meet. On the right-hand side, you see the timeline, like me focusing in a little bit more on some of those dates. And see, you can see how different groups are created and made, different racial category groups are created. So racialized statuses are the culmination of relations that racialized people have to the land that they're on and the means of production, and also specifically Euro-colonial imperialist interests. So it's about what the colonizers want and what gets the colonizers paid. And the most important thing to regarding establishing relationships and who is who, a people become native or indigenous because colonizers arrived. Arrival, because that arrival usually has to do with some form of displacement or dispossession. So a way to start thinking about this is going back to Wright's example. I really think that the neighborhood is a really interesting way to think about it, right? So Wright defined a neighborhood as a local population in which individuals are neighbors in the sense that their gametes may come together. So what you see below that definition is basically a null hypothesis based on that definition. The probability of genotypes today is some function of migration and population size over time and through space. Ultimately, what this means is that, well, in Dr. Wright's neighborhood, we are concerned with the probability of gametes meeting. And the assumption that we have in regards to that probability, estimating it, is that we're under the impression that the likelihood of gametes meeting is a function of the relative distance of gametes to one another in time and space, their dispersal distance. So if we start thinking about the way we know racial residential segregation behaves, it starts to get really weird with regards to if they're physically close to you, that necessarily means that you will share gametes. We know that's not necessarily how that works. There are a number of different things that can keep people from sharing gametes. A good chunk of them are laws. That's a good example. The threat of death, imprisonment, your family being harmed, for example. Ultimately, what this helps demonstrate and show us is that there's something that's being ignored here. It's a material and physiological fact that social divisions of people and land affect how gametes will be likely to meet in Wright's concept of a neighborhood. So that means that just because the dispersal distance is one particular relationship does not mean that doesn't give us a lot of information about that likelihood, that probability. That's a specific informative piece of information, but it can only tell us so much. Clearly something's up, right? I would think so. So like I think the thing to do is to start thinking about it with respect to what I said earlier. Population geneticists are telling stories. So here's an example. On the left, you see a picture of Lewis Hughes, who was born, if I'm not mistaken, into slavery. And one of his statements, one of the things he wrote, saying it was held by many that Virginia had the best slaves. So when Mr. McGee found I was born and bred in that state, he seemed satisfied. The bidding commenced, and I remember well when the auctioneer said $380 once, twice, and sold to Mr. Edward McGee. So people were bred. That's the one. Human beings were bred. That's the importance of the chattel principle. Thinking about partis sequitur ventrum again. There's a number of different things for us to take in consideration. How someone ends up being ripped away from their family and moved to a completely different state potentially or location, right? Or give this example of an escape, a quote unquote escaped slave, specifically the runaway ad for Harriet Jacobs. There's reasons to run away, which can also affect how you move through time and space. Wright's neighborhood, like just assuming things based on distance dispersal is not going to help us understand how we got to this point. So back to partis sequitur ventrum. The importance and significance of that is it's a law that was established that the European colonialists used to basically distill the chattel status, the status of slavery, down to maternal inheritance. And the way that that was done is best understood by understanding the relationships that these things have to a number of different material, very, very important material components of life, which is land, resources, right? And then the relationships we all have to them. Chattel status is directly linked to settler colonialism and indigenous dispossession through what it does, as well as what it did, or rather how it works. So settlement requires two things: land seizure and labor exploitation. And most importantly, land seizure is not possible without a supply of livestock, right, or workers whose labor can be endlessly exploited for the expansion of capitalist production and profit. So racism was created by and for Euro imperialism for the sole purpose of co-opting, marking, and grouping people to arrange and regulate the reproduction and inheritance of population-specific modes of colonial domination through time. And ultimately, what this tells us is more than anything else, not only is race a social construct, racism is a colonial breeding program. It played a very significant role and still plays a significant role in structuring human populations, well, for at least the last 500 to 600 years. So then, well, how do we reconceptualize how we think about racism and genes, right? So on this slide on the left, you see an interaction chart. So this interaction graph, this plot, is showing the relationship between average diastolic blood pressure and the CYP11B2 candidate polymorphism that is associated with hypertension. IRER is referring to a particular measurement of racialization. So this is from the third chapter of my dissertation from preliminary study I did of a sample of 89 individuals who we had genotype information as well as blood pressure measures for, and looking at the relationship that those things have to these different ways that we ask questions about what they believe was their quote unquote racialized disposition or distinction. So sire self-identify race and ethnicity. You know, what race do you identify as? IRER is based off of asking respondents, what race do you think other people think you are when they meet you? which is a little bit different. It's a different set of interactions and relationships. So that is telling us external environmental information. Clearly, the genotypes at the CYP11B2 locus they're definitely affected by the environment, the different environments that people are experiencing. Most importantly, those environments are really treatment, and how people are racialized in society it basically dictates and tells people how we're supposed to treat one another. And it's important to also think about this in regards to the previous slide that I just showed, thinking about those relationships, right? So that is, I'm interested in a particular set of interactions. So it's important to keep in mind that genetic and environmental causation are each of two types, genetic and environmental, right? And it's really important to understand that there could be defects, predispositions, of course, yes, genetic, but also there are events, catastrophes, like the transoceanic slave trade, for instance, or the murdering of indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, for example, and they have a cumulative effects. And these are some definitions just on the side so people can just keep in mind what I mean when I'm referring to genotype and phenotype. So this is on the left-hand side, an image that's showing some interaction plots, similar to the ones that I had. But this is kind of like just distilled down in a basic conceptual way. So gene by environment interactions occur when the performance of different genotypes is unequally affected by a change in the environment. Not to mention the fact that not just a change in the environment, the fact that there's just are different environments, and then they also change in different ways at different rates, at different intensities. So there were interactions that I did find in that study, and I'm particularly interested in trying to see how we've been incorrectly measuring race ultimately, because really what these racialized identities, quote unquote, measure are just the relationships that we have to everyone else around us in our experiences. So in conclusion, we can go back to the unanswered questions, right? If race is socially constructed, why do we even see biological differences between races? Well, that's because white people, quote unquote, bred people and had laws that control who could have children with whom and interact with whom on what terms for approximately 500 to 600 years. And if you do it long enough, yeah, you're going to see consequences. Racism put it there. How can the biological effects of racism be studied without racializing biology and genetics? Well, it just requires that we describe human genetic variation in its actual historical context and contemporary conditions. You have to tell the truth. That means we have to stop believing white people. That's one. We actually got to find out what actually happened. So, also, last thing, acknowledgments. On the left-hand side is an engravement that's actually on the castle at Cape Coast in Ghana, in West Africa. In everlasting memory of the anguish of our ancestors, may those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetuate such an injustice against humanity. We, the living, vow to uphold this. I would like to thank my committee members, Dr. Roseman, Dr. Malhi, Dr. Roca, Dr. Tallbear, and of course, Dr. Jackson, who couldn't be here. Also, thank you. And also, most importantly, my family, especially my grandmother, Virginia Gammons, and my close friends for all their support. Appreciate everybody. And last but not least, I said what I said. I'm done. Questions?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot. If we could all express our appreciation for Mr. McLean's talk, and either through the reaction button or through the chat, that would be lively. I have already made a mistake, and I apologize to the other members of the committee. We were supposed to have a session where we strategized about today's program. I neglected to do that and immediately jumped into the presentation. My apologies. I meant no disrespect. We'll do that at the beginning of our private session. I'd like to welcome questions from people, and what I would appreciate everyone doing is that after we're done expressing our appreciation, if you wouldn't mind either writing your question in chat or indicating that you would like to ask a question, and we will get to you in the order in which they come in. And it'll also give us some sense of what questions are coming up.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out where the hand is to raise my hand. I can't even, why can I never find this? Sorry. But since I'm talking, can I ask a quick question?
Please go ahead. It turns out that under the change in settings, the hand option is no longer available. So let's do this through chat. So please go ahead.
Okay, my last call, all that stuff was there. Shay-Akil, I'm just wondering if I get a copy of the slides you just did so I can refer back to them the rest of today, like a Google link to them or something, if you don't mind sharing them with me.
No problem. I'll get to sending that to you right now.
Okay, thank you.
And if you would indicate if you'd like to ask a question in the chat, I'd appreciate that. And I will try to get as many of you as I possibly can. And we don't want to exhaust Mr. McLean today, so let's try to keep it to 10 or 15 minutes. Any questions? Okay, Amanda Michelle Jones has indicated that she has a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question in total? It looks like you're putting together a thread there that might just be better voice.
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you. I don't know why I'm struggling with this little keyboard. I'm kind of feeling though, like, what now? Like I feel like we knew, well, some of us knew, right, about race and biology not being what it's purported to be. And I'm just kind of like, I think about your discussions online and just my observations of people really committed to like this ancestry DNA, even to the point of like that, who was the latest professor faking their identity? I don't remember.
Yeah, it was. It was like a new one in the last week, I think.
Right. So,
it happened like every other week.
I wake up and I'm like, oh, there's another one.
Yeah.
And so I just, but they used her ancestry records to track, which is more family history, I think in this case, but people are really dedicated to, I'm going to take a DNA swab and send it to 23andMe or Ancestry or even African Ancestry, or, and how I wonder, people are finding family and they're able to verify it through family history records, but I'm also very confused about how this works and how do we get people off this train that seems to have run away?
Well, yeah. So regarding that, one, it requires that people actually learn about the history of the last approximately at least 700 years. That would help, because unfortunately, if you are racialized as Black and part of diaspora, and especially in the United States, we're generally told we don't know where we're from. That's a lie. If there's anything that I know that a white person always keeps, it's a receipt. The receipts are the colonial archives. That is where the information about where our people are from is. It's part of it, and then we use the other historical information in order to make inferences about how we got to this point. That's what's required. So that's one. So we got to stop believing what white people tell us about ourselves and about everybody else. That's the first step. The second step is decide ultimately also what we're going to do regarding believing the script. Ultimately, what supposedly race is supposed to be. Race, quote unquote, biological race, quote unquote, is an argument. That's not family. That's not ancestry. There's a number of people who have family who are not in the same race. We ought to know that's not how that works. So we got to start having a lot more upfront conversations ultimately. And most importantly, we have to start unpacking the fact that we racialize biology and we racialize genetics as a justification for us to then treat each other like crap. Because that's ultimately what's going on. And the thing to move on to next is, well, let's start having a conversation about what does it look like to develop scientific knowledge about life and organisms beyond just humans, because everything is not about humans. We're animals as well. We're mammals. We need to figure out how we're gonna produce that knowledge now, given the historical context that we have. Because ultimately we have to, in order to say in order to answer the question, how do we get here? We have to figure out what happened. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. I think that gives me a lot to ponder as I work on my family history.
Okay.
Without the databases and DNA.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. The first question that we have lined up comes from Graciela Cabana. So if you wouldn't mind chiming in here, I'd appreciate that.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, Shay-Akil. Nice
Hey.
job. I loved listening to your defense. Totally appreciate your work. I just had a quick question, something that just sort of occurred to me with one of your slides, and I thought it would be fun as a kind of a thought experiment. One of your early slides, when you ask how do population geneticists use race to describe human variation prior to 500 to 600 years ago, and your answer was they don't, at least at that point in your presentation. And thought I might ask you, what do you make of so-called like Denisovans, Neanderthals, modern humans, what the relationship is between these made-up categories and contemporary race concepts? And could you see the use of these categories as sort of an extension of these colonial race or contemporary race projects that you were talking about?
So yes, in short, yes, that's exactly what they are. The categorizations that we've been using in the first place, ultimately, it's not just about how we build relationships to each other. It's about how we build relationships to all forms of life. And I think one of the things that kind of is a good example of just kind of thinking about the scale of that is look at the planet's on fire and pandemic. And not to mention the fact pandemics are generally started when a particular quote unquote pathogen is allowed to pass, generally from an animal that's usually of another species, and that takes a series of long bit of time. Like, so it's the whole thing. It's the entire thing. The entire great chain of being has to go. The ladder got to go. It has to fall. It's because ultimately that's clearly not how this stuff works. So I with respect now, when I say that, I mean in respect to regards to all the evidence of the destruction it's created. And hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Ogadinma Okakpu. If you please
Yeah.
go ahead and
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Just want to say congrats, Shay, for all your work.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, appreciate you. But let me go ahead and talk about the question. I mean, one of the things I think we see, especially online, with is the conflation of race and biology. I'm reminded of a recent interaction I had with North Africans citing a bunch of basically eugenic anthropology studies where they said that indigenous North Africans weren't black because they didn't have haplotype groups that were found in Eastern Africans and West Sub-Saharan Africans, basically trying to racialize what a haplogroup, the meaning of a haplogroup, not understanding what a haplogroup even means. How do we kick out these type of eugenicist thoughts in academia, because it seems to be like academia honestly is driving a lot of these sentiments with these these nonsense cosines of the science that just doesn't match up.
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, that's like the question when it comes to combating propaganda ultimately, because that's really what it is.
Right.
I think that the closest thing to an answer, like an actionable answer to that question, is we have to change the way we produce knowledge. Like really, like it's got to change. One, two, we got to do the change really fast. There's very little time, if there is any, because the thing is that unfortunately, it reminds me of Toni Morrison. She called racism, she said it was a distraction. Like, there's so much other stuff we could be doing, right? A lot of energy has to be put in now to contextualizing everything that we do know about life with actually telling the truth about what racism is, and then starting to change the way we build relationships between things, our understandings of the world, constantly thinking everything is a binary or a dualism.
Right.
We actually have to, like, everybody stop, let's go back to the chalkboard, because something clearly is up. So I think that's the thing that's necessary. Two, people need to accept the fact that ultimately that is always a political project. If you cannot recognize how dangerous that is, then ultimately it's not really going to mean too much to you, right? And I think that's one of the problems, because people in a number of cases think that sometimes we can argue the science and then they should understand. No, that's not how racism works. So that means we need a different strategy for how we deal with those people, in my opinion. If that answers the question, hopefully.
Yeah, that was a great response.
Okay, looks like we have time for one or two more questions. Shara Goldsmith indicated that this was going to be your question. Did you want to follow up on that and with anything? Shara Goldsmith, are you there?
Hi, greetings all. Yes, I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of the previous speaker's question. Do you feel like this shift is just in higher realms of academia, or do you feel like this is a project that needs to span the entire scope of education? For example, I'm a preschool teacher.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you think that even the way that we, like, as you said, as we, what we know, how we teach what we know, and completely what we know has to change. So.
Yeah, and that's definitely a good question, because of course we have to think about how do you make sure you prevent people from getting to the point where they can get it wrong in the first place, and then the dangers of that and the reasons behind that. But I think most importantly, yes, this has to scale up and down everywhere. And one of the central components to building relationships in societies are like different institutions that are responsible for socialization. Education is the central one. If we want people to stop doing something, usually we should start there. Like we have to change how we talk about bodies, how we talk about each other, how we talk about ourselves. Ultimately, it requires a change in language, which is, of course, a part of a political change and social change, a political project, importantly. Because ultimately, yeah, this is stuff they tell you since you was a little kid. We know how this starts. So I think that it definitely is something that has to change everywhere.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
We have time for one more question, and the last person to ask a question is Blair Imani. If you wouldn't mind unmuting and chiming in, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Excellent work, Shay, as always.
Thanks.
My question is in reference to your final takeaway from the dissertation defense, which is requiring human genetic variation to be discussed in the actual historical context and contemporary conditions. I would love if you could discuss briefly why you think this hasn't happened in the past, especially considering the intentional nature of how race and racism is discussed as, you know, presented in your presentation.
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that the way to really achieve that with respect to embedding the actual historical context into human genetic variation, like, is what we do, what actually have a settler colonial critique, which is central to our historical analysis, and we have to start analyzing the context of multiple histories. We like there's a very, very interesting Euro-Western perspective regarding the history of one people is the history of one people, and they must have never interacted with one another, or no event has. It's very weird that we have to start changing the ways that we produce knowledge about how we got here. So I think that's a central component to work that basically the biologists and geneticists have to do if they want to study any form of life ultimately, because one of the problems that we have right now is, well, look at all the effects that humans have had on the planet. There's a crap ton of things that have gone extinct and a whole bunch more on their way out. The planet's on fire. So ultimately, I think everybody who is studying any kind of life has to needs that historical context, because it wasn't there before. And it wasn't there before because it's not that it was just simply absent. What was actually present there was lies, because those lies were beneficial. It was propaganda, colonial propaganda specifically, because we always got to pay close attention to the meaning of that timeline. Is what Europeans, the thing to always take into consideration, the idea that physical characteristics of what race is a post hoc phenomena, meaning that they came up with that idea after they already did it. They was already doing stuff. That's one of the important things I'm trying to point out with those sequences of those events in the timeline, thinking about the relationships that they have to one another. Well, one of the things that anthropologist Patrick Wolf talked about in his book Traces of History, Europeans had already practiced like the kind of relations that they basically utilize to colonize everywhere else. They did it to each other first. That's the context, or part of the context, for the great feudal crisis in around the 14th century. You just think about the relationship between the British and the Irish. The British and people who are Jewish. These are all, they had the forms of this doctrine. This is political doctrine more than anything else. So we have to recognize that and not deny it, and then figure out what we're gonna do about it. Hope that was an answer. A good answer.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all for participating and listening to the Q&A. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for staying till the end here. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Shay-Akil McLean, Ph.D. He has successfully completed and defended a dissertation pending some revisions that he will be making over the next couple of weeks with the aim of depositing the final copy in December. As I said before in our private meeting, it's been a distinct pleasure working with you. I've learned so much, and you're a scholar with remarkable breadth and depth. It's you're very serious about many things, and that's a rare bird indeed. So thank you very much for your perseverance and all your hard work, and it's been a pleasure going along with this.
Thanks, Charles. Appreciate it. Thank
No
you,
worries.
Dr. Tallbear, Red Pen, and Roca, and Dr. Jackson, even though she's not here. But she will be in this. So.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Oh my goodness.
Congratulations.
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 So many
Congrats.
congratulations.
Time to celebrate.
Finally.
Oh,
yeah.
Congrats,
journey.
Now
He got to move to Atlanta.
Yes. I'm ordering pizza.
You did it.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Nice.
Oh.
Great weekend.
All right.
Bye.